Our husband and wife team of pop culture fanatics are exploring all things from music and movies to television and fandom. We'll look at the interesting and obscure entertainment news of the week. We'll talk about theme park and pop culture news. We'll give you the latest and greatest on pop culture conventions. We'll give you a deep dive into Disney, Star Wars, and much more. Check out our video episodes at youtube.com/insightsintothings. Our audio episodes at podcast.insightsintoentertainment.com, or check us out on the web at insightsintothings.com. Insightful podcasts by informative hosts. Insights into Things, a podcast network. Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow, where we take a deeper look into how the issues of today will impact the world of tomorrow. From politics and world news to media and technology, we discuss how today's headlines are becoming tomorrow's reality.
Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow. This is episode 7, Deadly Force. I'm your host, Joseph Whalen, and my slightly out of frame co-host, Sam Whalen.
Hello.
How you doing today, Sam?
I'm doing fine.
So, with everything that's been going on in the wake of the George Floyd death and the protests and everything else, you and I had wanted to do something on the topic, but I think we kind of came to the conclusion that we probably are not qualified to do commentary on Black Lives Matter. So I thought the one thing that we could address from this whole thing is the root cause of it, the police use of deadly force. So that's what today's episode is going to be about. Any comments?
Well, before we get into it, I mean, even though we're not talking about Black Lives Matter, it's obviously still very important. So make sure you sign petitions, donate, things like that. Just because we're not talking about it, I don't want people to get the impression that we're, stepping aside from it. Would still, fully support it, at least,
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is very good to mention that, we aren't talking about it because I don't think we're the experts. We
Exactly.
can't bring the perspective to it. So I don't want to do it in a way, I don't want to cover it in a way that it can't be covered comprehensively and from the right angle.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we're the people that can do that.
Yeah.
So this is our attempt at supporting Black Lives Matter by bringing these things to the forefront. These are really the root cause of it is really the police violence and the treatment of minorities by police and the profiling and everything else. And we're not going to get into everything, and then this is not an episode to bash police. This is really, we wanted to draw attention to the fact that there are standards out there. There are mixed standards that are not applied evenly across the board, but there are standards out there that are intended to allow the police to do their job without having incidents like George Floyd happened.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those standards are not followed, and that's where we wind up in these situations, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Yep.
So with that in mind, are we ready to move forward?
Yep.
So the first thing I think we kind of need to do before we dig into the meat and potatoes of the subject is kind of define what deadly force is. So deadly force, this comes from Wikipedia, So it's a pretty generic definition. Deadly force or lethal force is use of force that is likely to cause serious bodily injury or death to another person. In most jurisdictions, the use of deadly force is justified only under conditions of extreme necessity as a last resort. All lesser means have failed or cannot reasonably be employed. It goes on to say that firearms, bladed weapons, explosives, and vehicles are among those weapons, the use of which is considered deadly force. The use of non-traditional weapons in an offensive manner, such as baseball bat, sharp pencil, tire iron, or other items, may also be considered deadly force. So let's just take a second to talk about that. So in certain circumstances, police are authorized to use deadly force. But that does not give police the right to be judge, jury, and executioner. So there has to be some restraint placed on that. Did you have any comments on our definition that we're working off of?
No, I think it's definitely accurate. I mean, it says when all lesser means have failed, and I think that as we go on, we're going to see that that's not always used as a last resort. That sometimes, well, more often than not, that deadly force is employed in situations where there were other options, maybe, and it's murky because the officer can always say that their life was in danger, which can be open to interpretation. But I do think that in this instance, the deadly force should be used as the last resort. And, as I said, we'll go through and see how often that applies.
Right. So there is a legal standard for using deadly force by police. So, broadly speaking, the use of deadly force by law enforcement is necessary and permitted under specific circumstances, such as self-defense or in defense of another individual or group. And this is kind of what you were mentioning, where that's kind of the out, where if the officer says, well, I thought my life was in danger, in some jurisdictions that gives him the right to use deadly force, even if the person they're trying to apprehend is not committing crimes that warrant that level of response. The problem I think we've run into is that there is no single universally agreed upon set of rules for use of force. The International Association of Chiefs of Police has described the use of force as amount of effort required by police to compel compliance by an unwilling subject. Now, I think you'll agree that's a pretty vague standard that we have there. What concerns do you have about that standard that they have?
Well, I mean, ultimately, in the court of public opinion, you'd think that it would be more, you trust the police. You're supposed to trust your police. But in these instances, when they're the one that may hold all the power in these situations, and it's their word before yours, they're the ones that get to write the narrative in these situations. And I think that can be dangerous, especially when you bring in things like systematic racism and profiling and things like that, which can skew what an officer may do and their motivations behind it.
Right. I agree. And it goes on to say that officers, they receive guidance from their individual agencies, but there's no federal mandate, let's say, for rules that govern when officers should use force. And that use of force has to be there's the context in which the situation has to be taken into context. There's no two situations that are the same, and there are no two officers that are the same. So there isn't an automated response. Like it's not like machines,
mm-hmm.
Where you can perform the same thing over and over. The situations are always different. And in potentially threatening situations, an officer will quickly tailor the response to apply force. And, looking at it from the perspective of a police officer, you don't have a lot of time in dangerous situations to make a decision. Sometimes people, a scenario that comes to mind is you're responding to an alleged armed robbery. and you chase a subject into a dark alley, and the subject reaches into his pants to pull something out. As a police officer, you've got a split-second decision there to determine, is this guy pulling out his ID? Is he pulling out a gun? Is my life in danger? And in that split second is where tragedies happen. Situational awareness is also essential in these cases. Officers are trained to judge when a crisis requires the use of force and to regain control of a situation. Now, my concern there is that not all officers receive the same training. There's no uniform training across the board throughout the country. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know if you watched Last Week Tonight with John Oliver,
but
they talk about this one specific kind of trainer that it's almost like seminars that he goes around. This guy goes around the country, and I forget his name. And he goes around the country and trains police. And he has this like predator mindset where he encourages police to be like apex predators. And so this guy has gone all around the country. So you have no idea what kind of training these officers are getting, just like you said, because there's no set standard. So you could get certain places where they have very dangerous, hunter-killer mindsets, but in other situations, maybe they're encouraged to be more peaceful and less reactive and violent. So
right.
The fact that there's no standard leaves a lot of it up to chance almost.
So it's worthwhile to talk about the amount of force that is used, because I think we can all agree that when a police officer is responding to an incident and you have a non-cooperative suspect, chances are you're going to have to use some kind of level of force, whether that's vocal persuasion or you have to resort to physical use, whatever it is. So law enforcement officers should use only the amount of force necessary to mitigate the incident, make an arrest, or protect themselves and others from harm. Now, one of the problems that I have with that is you oftentimes have police that do things like engage in high-speed pursuits. You pull somebody over at a traffic stop and they had a taillight out. And the police go up to question the individual, and the individual takes off, and then the police engage in a high-speed pursuit. So now the original offense here is a broken traffic light. You can speculate on what else that person might be guilty of because of them fleeing, but is what they might be guilty of worth putting at risk all the other pedestrians and drivers that are on the road through a high-speed chase?
No, and I think that even not just high-speed chases, but that situation could be anything, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about it more once we get to specific cases. But at what point is a person's death warranted?
Exactly.
There always should be another way.
Right. So there are levels. There's a continuum of police force that's used, which includes basic verbal and physical restraint, less lethal force, and as high as lethal forces. And the level of force that an officer uses varies based on situation. I think we can both agree on that. Because of this, guidelines for the use of force are based on many factors, including the officer's level of training or experience. Now, unfortunately, the research that I did didn't really delve too much into what level of force you can apply at your level of experience, but I think that's crucial. A lot of the incidents that we've seen recently have been very experienced officers who have been involved in these. So if the training is proportional to your experience and the level of force is proportional to your experience, I think we have a disconnect.
And even then, you have to wonder if people, in a situation where more cops are required, if people are getting pushed to the academy faster than they should be, who are we putting out on the streets with maybe less training, but just the same capability to use as much force as an experienced officer? They still all have the same equipment, on some level.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take much to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot to know when to pull the trigger.
Mm-hmm.
An officer's goal is to regain control as soon as possible when protecting the community. That control dynamic, I think, is what a lot of this deadly force comes down to. Because the police are trained to operate from a level of authority. And when that authority is undermined, you tend to get an emotional response from the police. And that emotional response is fueled by the need for them to be in that authority dynamic. And when that fails, then things start to break down. The use of force is supposed to be an officer's last option, not their first. And it's sometimes a necessary course of action to restore safety in the community. Injuries may incur with the use of force, and I think we can all agree that if you're being restrained because you're resisting arrest, there's a very good chance that an injury could occur. Police should ensure that the injured receive medical aid and that the family of any injured person is notified. That's where some of the dispute comes in with some of the latest incidents that we've had. For instance, we're going to talk about George Floyd a little bit more later in the show. But George Floyd had an officer kneeling on his neck for almost 9 minutes. And 3 of those 9 minutes, he was unresponsive, not breathing, and had no pulse. And none of the officers, when he was in that condition, attempted to render assistance.
Well, there were also not just the one on his neck, but there were also other officers on his back and his legs.
Yeah.
Just pressing him into the ground.
Yeah.
And you can there's footage out there. The first one that, blew up was the one of just the officer with the knee on his neck. But later on, there was footage that came out of the other officers from the other side of the street watching, also pinning him down. It's horrific to watch.
It is. I mean, it almost looks like he was intentionally executed. Yeah. So the police use something called the use of force continuum, or the use of force spectrum, and that kind of tells you when to use what level of force. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about that in more detail. For over 7 years, the Second Sith Empire has been the premier community guild in the online game Star Wars: The Old Republic. With hundreds of friendly and helpful active members, a weekly schedule of nightly events, annual guild meet and greets, and an active community both on the web and on Discord. The Second Sith Empire is more than your typical gaming group. We're family. Join us on the Starforge server for nightly events such as operations, flashpoints, world boss hunts, Star Wars trivia, guild lottery, and much more. Visit us on the web today at www.thesecondsithempire.com. So the use of force continuum is really kind of a spectrum of what level of force to use when in certain situations. The Supreme Court has recognized that the right to make an arrest or investigatory stop necessarily carries with it the right to use some degree of physical coercion or threat. Now, that statement itself
sounds kind of scary.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of disturbing, isn't it?
It almost puts it in that they should go in with a hostile mindset.
Exactly.
Which is not what they should be doing.
Which I think is exactly what is happening in a lot of situations. And when you see a lot of these movements to defund the police, it's driven by that mindset of every time you call 911, whether it's for a domestic dispute, a car accident, a heart attack, the first person to show up is a police officer with a gun and this mindset of I'm the authority. And that immediately puts a lot of people on a defensive posture at that point in time.
Especially if the police are going into a situation that's already really tense and already right on the brink of like a powder keg almost. You have an officer show up who is armed, and that can without the officer even doing anything, unfortunately, can add another degree of tension to that situation.
Absolutely. You're injecting an aggressive mentality into a situation that's already about to explode.
Especially if it's in a situation dealing with minorities or a low income area, because they're already suspicious of police to begin with because of police violence and, things like that.
Absolutely. So the degree of coercion or force used must be proportional to the threat and escalate only in response to the threat. Most law enforcement agencies have policies that guide their use of force, but again, they're not applied evenly across the board throughout the country. The policies describe an escalating series of actions an officer may take to resolve the situation. This continuum generally has many levels, and officers are instructed to respond with a level of force appropriate to the situation at hand, acknowledging that the officer may move from one part of the continuum to another in a matter of seconds. So again, timing is of the essence. So what we have here is a example of what a threat continuum is. So the first level is the most basic, officer presence. Police officer shows up, no force is needed. This is considered the best way to resolve a situation. The mere presence of a law enforcement officer works to deter crime and diffuse a situation. Officers' attitudes are professional and non-threatening. Hopefully, this is the majority of the interactions that you have with the police when they're called out for something. Mm-hmm. But like you said, even this can be an aggravating element to a situation. So the next level they have is what they call verbalization, where physical force is not required. Officers issue calm, non-threatening commands. Let me see your identification and registration. Officers may increase their volume, shorten their commands in an attempt to gain compliance. Short commands might include stop, don't move. Now, let me ask you, have you ever been pulled over by police?
No, not yet. I mean, I've been in situations where I've dealt with police, like I've been in a car accident. I wasn't the one driving, I was a passenger. I was pulled over. I wasn't the one pulled over. Again, I was a passenger, so I didn't have to talk to the police. The driver did. So I've never really had any where I did something that the police need to talk to me. I've always been a passenger or someone on the sidelines.
Right. So. Now, I'll say I've been pulled over a couple of times by police. Once you were actually in the car, and you were actually the reason that we wound up getting pulled over. We had gone out somewhere, you, me, and your mom, and the car we were in broke down. Mm-hmm. So we had to use a pickup truck to get home. We had you in a car seat. That's how young you were at the time. And in order to put you in a car seat, in a 3-person seat in a pickup truck, mm-hmm. your mom had to sit in the middle where there was no seatbelt. Mm-hmm. So we got pulled over by police, and the police wanted to know why one of the passengers was in the middle, because they couldn't see the car seat. They wanted to know why someone was in the middle and not in a seatbelt. Mm-hmm. And this was kind of a learning experience for me because, I pulled over, pulled out the registration, all that stuff. Cop asked for it, asked me to get out of the truck, and then walked me around the back of the truck so I was out of traffic danger. And, he's looking at my documentation, and just casually I put my hands in my pocket, not thinking anything of it. And he immediately triggers on that. He's like, don't put your hands in your pocket. And I'm like, oh, sorry. Mm-hmm. But in explaining the situation to him, he was very professional, totally understood the situation. I was cooperative with him the entire time, and he obviously let us go. But anytime that people are driving and they have a police officer show up behind them with flashing their lights, that's kind of an anxiety situation there, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of new to driving. I've been driving for like a little under a year. And one time I was coming back from college, which is like a 20-minute drive. Most of it's highway driving. And I had a cop behind me on the highway the whole time. And I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I was always looking behind me, looking at the cop, which, distracts you from driving. Eventually, he followed me all the way down to, there's a barbecue place nearby, and he turned off. He was just getting some food. But he followed me for so long, it almost made me, I felt like I was more likely to get into an accident or do something wrong because I was so nervous about the cop behind me.
Yeah, and that sort of speaks to what you were saying with just having police involved changes the entire dynamic of a situation. People act differently. We had the incident of the woman who was in Central Park, and she didn't have her dog on a leash, and an African-American man who was in the park approached her and said, you need to have your dog on your leash. Well, she made a big deal about it, calling the police, saying this man was threatening her and everything, and basically leveraged what she knew was her power as
Privilege
a
and
white
power.
privileged individual. And she knew how the police were going to react to it. So
He's lucky. That guy's lucky. Oh God, that's such a bad situation. She's lucky she didn't get that guy killed.
yeah, it's incredible. But the police response was so predictable that you knew how to manipulate the situation.
Yeah, and talking about our experiences with police, again, there is the issue of race coming up. I mean, we're two white men.
Yep.
And I think that, I mean, I've heard so many accounts from people of color that have been pulled over, and their situations were entirely different.
Absolutely.
The police are immediately suspicious in those situations of people that were doing nothing wrong. And I think that it's difficult to talk about these police issues without the issue of race. You know,
Yeah.
you can't, the two are not, you know, they have to be brought together.
I agree. And the reason that I mentioned my incident was I am a white guy.
Right.
So my experience was much better than a minority's experience would. And I was still terrified at what this police officer was going to do because at that point in time, he wields all the power.
Yeah.
And that's frightening. So moving down the spectrum, we get to empty hand control, where an officer uses bodily force to gain control of a situation. The soft techniques would be using grabs, holds, and joint locks. And you get to the hard techniques where you start throwing punches and kicks to restrain an individual. So this is where we start getting into that potential for physical harm. The next step that they have is less lethal methods. Officers will use less lethal technologies to gain control of a situation, using blunt impact, using batons or projectiles. They can resort to chemicals, using chemical sprays or projectiles, pepper balls that they fire at you.
These things are not less lethal. I mean, these can kill people. There's been instances, I know with the protests going on with chemicals, the use of tear gas and things, they can affect people, especially with breathing conditions or in your contacts. It can permanently blind you. And there was a woman at one point who I think she had asthma and the tear gas got in her lungs and she died from it because she had a reaction to it.
Yes.
And then blunt impact, the use of a baton, I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. You could, if somebody hits the concrete because you knocked them out with a baton, that might be out of your hands and not your intention, but that could still kill them.
Well, and you can still kill somebody with a blunt impact.
Right.
If I hit you on the head with a baton, I can cause brain damage and kill you.
And the last one, the CEDs, or conducted energy devices to immobilize a target. Tasers, right? That's
what your tasers are, yeah.
Those have set people on fire in some instances, stop people's hearts if they've got pacemakers that the officer is unaware of.
Yep.
And look, I understand that if someone with a pacemaker tries to pull a gun on the police officer, the cop's not going to have time to worry about that to tase him. But it's these methods that we're using that even if we're trying to make them less lethal, there is still the potential for killing somebody.
And I think the problem we have with these is labeling them as less than lethal generates this air of casualness about them. Like, oh, well, if you're acting up, I can just tase you.
Right.
And that'll settle you right down. And I don't have to wrestle you to the ground at that point in time. And you can kill somebody with it, either through electrocuting them, stopping their heart, or when they go down, it's very easy for them to hit their head and whatever, because you're uncontrolled when you go down. You see these demonstrations of tasers, with the police academy, and I've been tased in the past in a demonstration. It's not pleasant, and it took 3 people to hold on to me and gently put me down on the ground. Can you imagine if someone my size was tased without that kind of restraint?
We'd hit the ground hard. Yeah.
It's frightening. And then obviously the last level that we have in the continuum is lethal force. Officers use lethal weapons to gain control of a situation. Should only be used if a suspect poses a serious threat to the officer or another individual. Officers use deadly weapons such as firearms to stop an individual's actions. And this is an alternative. It has to be an alternative because there are perpetrators out there that will use deadly force indiscriminately, whether it's targeted at police, at citizens, or whatnot. We had an incident, a year ago, 2 years ago, near the Deptford Mall near us, where shoplifters were identified, I guess, by the store security. The police were called, and the shoplifters got into a waiting car, and the car gunned it right at a police officer in its path. And the police officer pulled his weapon and fired and killed an individual in the car as a matter of self-defense, is what he claimed at the time. So a car is a deadly weapon, and they tried to use it like that, if nothing else, to intimidate the police officer in vacating the way. Should the person have been killed for shoplifting? That's a pretty extreme.
I think if in that instance, I know that I mentioned it earlier, the use of the reasoning, officer's life was threatened. But in that instance, they might have been if they were driving at the police officer.
That's true. The problem that I have in that situation is you're in a crowded plaza. There are other citizens, other pedestrians around. What's the guarantee that you're not going to fire your weapon, discharge your weapon, miss the target, and then hit an innocent civilian for a shoplifter? That's where a lot of my concern is.
And that's not even mentioning that on the way over here, I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about what we're talking about now, the excessive use of police force. And in a lot of these instances, it's traffic stops, and an officer ends up pulling a gun because the person's not cooperating. And yes, the person should cooperate, but that doesn't give the officer the right to pull a gun.
Right.
Judging by what we just talked about, the officer should be pulling a gun when they feel their life's at risk.
Exactly.
Not because the person won't hand over their ID.
Exactly. Use of threats, which the Supreme Court allows, does not necessarily mean threatening bodily harm with a weapon.
Yeah, they played a clip over here of a woman that recorded when she got pulled over, a person of color, and the police officer straight up told her, "I'm going to light you up." Like, they should not be saying things like this. And then that woman ended up dying, not in the traffic stop. 4 days later, she was found hung in her cell. It was rolled as a suicide. Her family didn't believe that. But it's things like this where the use of firearms to intimidate is a real problem.
Yeah. So let's take a quick break here, and we'll come back, and we're going to talk about what excessive force is and what unreasonable force is. So excessive force refers to situations where government officials, and we're not just talking police, this applies to military personnel as well. When government officials legally entitled to use force exceed the minimum amount necessary to defuse an incident or to protect themselves and others. This can come up in different contexts, such as when handling prisoners or even during military operations. When it involves law enforcement, especially during an arrest, it's also referred to as police brutality. The constitutional right to be protected from excessive force is found in the reasonable search and seizure requirement of the Fourth Amendment, and the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment is in the Eighth Amendment. So we're talking constitutional rights here. This is something that should not be left up to an officer on the street to determine what your constitutional right is at this point in time.
Yeah, but even the wording there allows for loopholes, right? Reasonable search and seizure, cruel and unusual punishment too. Like, a lot of these things can be twisted to waive those constitutional rights by an officer, I feel like. And I think that's where we get into the issues, is because a lot of these terms, even though they're right there in the Constitution, are purposely able to be manipulated and changed to allow for excessive force like this.
And that's a perfectly valid point. And a lot of times, if you're going to challenge these field interpretations of the Constitution, you have to do that in a court of law before a judge. And in order to do that, you have to survive the encounter. And if you don't, then it's really not in your favor at that point, is it? So unreasonable force, in the Supreme Court case of Tennessee versus Garner, the court found that police used excessive force by shooting an unarmed, non-threatening teenager in the head while fleeing a house he had burglarized. At the time, the Tennessee law authorized the use of, quote, all the necessary means to effect the arrest of fleeing suspects regardless of the situation. Which, what could possibly go wrong with that wording?
Yeah, I mean, I guess going into it, he had burglarized a house, so that was their justification. He might, I mean, even it says so non-threatening, so maybe they weren't aware that he wasn't armed. I don't know.
Well, he's running away. Who's he threatening while he's running away?
Not to mention that they're not supposed to shoot you in the head, right?
They're supposed to be aiming for center mass, right? So the court overturned the state law because it allowed for unreasonable use of force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. So again, we have to appeal to the courts. Doesn't do anything for the victim in this case, but hopefully we get some reform later on that it solves some of these problems. The court ruled that deadly force can only be used during an arrest if it's necessary to prevent the escape and the officer has probable cause to believe the suspect poses a significant threat of death or serious injury to the officers or others.
See, there's that loophole wording again, you know? I feel like, again, the officer, it goes to the office. The officer is the one that has to determine it. So again, we get back to what we talked about before, making those split-second decisions in the field. What is probable cause in any given situation if they're all different, you know?
Yeah, well, and I think in this case here, let's go back to that scenario we talked about in Deptford with the shoplifter. So somebody flooring it in the parking lot there, trying to kill an officer, let's say, could easily be construed as being dangerous to anybody else in that plaza as well. So there probably would be justified based on these rules.
Yep.
Here, if this kid is running away from the police, even if he had a gun, if he's not firing that gun off indiscriminately at other people, he's not immediately a threat. And
then necessary to prevent escape. If the kid was on foot, I mean, there had to have been another way.
Yeah, you can't run the radio, right? So police can easily call in backup for situations like that. So they go on to summarize and say excessive force by police brutality doesn't just apply to cases of deadly force, but can also be found where injuries are relatively minor, but resulted from the unreasonable use of force. So the headlines today are dealing with unfortunate deaths, which are obviously a concern, but you don't have to die in order to have a case against the police for unreasonable force. They could easily cause long-term permanent injury that's covered as well. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back and we're going to talk about some ways that you might be able to find some protections available. So excessive force is a constitutional violation that can be remedied by filing civil rights complaints for monetary or injunctive relief under Section 1983 of the United States Code. Okay, so if you survive the encounter, you can sue. I'm not sure that that's something that leaves a lot of comfort for the people that are victimized by this.
Well, that's if you can even afford to sue, right? I mean, the legal fees are going to get out of control, especially when these cops are typically backed by unions, which are going to, go to bat for them no matter what. And we're seeing that a lot now with the protests and then subsequent officers getting fired or paid leave, things like that.
Right.
Police unions are some of the biggest obstacles, and I know that we have a section on that coming up, but they're some of the biggest obstacles in any kind of actual law, civil suits or civil rights complaints, things like that.
Absolutely. Now, you can also file a complaint with the United States Department of Justice, who might decide to investigate your case, although that's optional for them. When deciding whether a government official, such as a police officer, engaged in excessive force, courts look at the totality of circumstances to determine whether the actions are objectively reasonable. In making this determination, judges use the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene lacking the benefit of hindsight. Now, let's take that statement for a second there. What is a reasonable officer?
Maybe they had a bad day. Maybe they had a bad morning. Bad cup of coffee.
Right. That's the thing. You've got human error written all over this because you don't know what mindset that person was in. You don't know if that person was an anti-Semite and dealing with a Jewish suspect or a racist dealing with an African-American suspect, and it completely changes the mindset.
Yeah, and I kind of think I'm kind of the mind where these things are worded intentionally, that the officers are always portrayed in this positive light in these kind of situations, even if they were the ones that took a life unnecessarily. They're the reasonable officer. They're without the benefit of hindsight, things like this. This is where the systematic aspect of it comes in.
It is, and again, I don't want to turn this into let's bash the police, because I think the vast majority of law enforcement officers out there are genuinely interested in enforcing the law and protecting people. But there are bad cops. We know there are bad cops. And the system itself does a very poor job of weeding out these bad cops.
And the bad cop argument is always, because that argument would never apply to any other profession. If a surgeon kills 10 people, they're not going to, they'll fire the surgeon. He'll get malpractice. He'll lose his license. If a cop kills someone like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, who's murderers or not murderers, that's a different subject, but those officers are still free to go. And in situations like that where people are killed for no reason, the bad apples are not taken care of properly.
I agree.
Yeah.
And when we get to the George Floyd case, we'll talk about that in more detail.
Yeah.
Hopefully what we're seeing today is going to change that. But yes, you're right. Traditionally, that's been the case.
I do think that also today, what we're living through now is important, because you have things like social media and public outcry that I think is making a lot of sweeping change to get rid of and tend to help the systematic issues that we're seeing now. People are calling it out. People are saying when they see it, so it's less obvious to hide.
We have a lot more tools today to point out the injustices that we had 10 years ago. So in talking about what remediation you have, we're talking about this perspective of a reasonable officer. So the courts analyze factors such as the severity of their underlying crime or circumstances, which, you look at the Eric Garner case where he was allegedly selling illegal cigarettes and was executed for it. I think we had a breakdown in the system there. They look at whether an immediate threat to safety of an officer or others exist. Perfectly reasonable. They look at whether the individual was actively resisting arrest or attempting to flee. Last time I checked, resisting arrest was not punishable by death. So, might have to throw that one out too. They look at whether there were alternatives that were available or whether warnings were provided that or could have been provided. So, and again, we're not talking about death in all of these. We're talking about excessive force. So these all do apply here, but again, the goal of this is to look at what the end game is on this here. And recently in the news, the end game has been executions.
Yeah. And another argument that's usually used to defend police that use excessive force is the whether warnings were provided or could have been provided. People say, oh, well, why didn't they just comply? Why didn't they just stop resisting? And it's not always that simple, especially if they're seriously injured. They might have been scared, scared for their life. If they're in pain or, I don't know, it's not as simple as, oh, you just ignored a warning, I think it's not as black and white as
well, and the problem that you have is the police are propagating this problem themselves with all of these incidents. If there's a high percentage chance of an African American getting pulled over by police and dying, then they're going to avoid being pulled over at all costs.
Yep.
Because I don't care if I have a broken tail light, you don't get to kill me for it. So that excessive use of force, and it's, the majority of, let's just say, traffic stops. The majority of traffic stops in this country every day go off without a hitch. There aren't any problems. The ones that are the issues that we're talking about are the ones that are getting all the social media attention. They're the outlying ones, but these obviously need to be addressed because these are the ones that are resulting in people dying. So they go on to say that along with deferring to law enforcement reasonableness standards, courts can also give officers qualified immunity. This protects public officials from civil liability for violations of rights so long as they were reasonably performing their duties and the rights involved were not clearly established. Now, this is where I have a problem.
It's like diplomatic immunity.
It is. And at what point in time and what court in this country has the right to deny someone their civil liberty rights? You don't. Even the Supreme Court cannot deny you your rights under the Constitution. So this whole idea of qualified immunity, I think, is a bad precedent that we have floating over us.
And it starts to blur the line between like protectors and guards almost, where their job is no longer to protect because they can get away with whatever they want.
That's exactly it. If you remove the consequences of someone's actions, they're not going to have any restraint whatsoever on those actions.
It reminds me of, and Watchmen on HBO is a great show that deals with a lot of this, but there's a quote from the original book where it says, "Who watches the Watchmen? Who oversees, these type of officials?"
Right. So they go on to kind of elaborate and say in excessive force cases, qualified immunity can protect police officers in harder to evaluate situations where there's a hazy border between excessive and acceptable force.
Yikes.
That's exactly what you don't want. You don't want to protect them there because you want them to understand the decision that I'm about to make in pulling this trigger is going to have consequences. And if there's no consequences associated with it, they're going to feel far more at ease to pull that trigger.
And it makes excessive force a more likely option too.
Exactly.
Which we talked about before, because if there isn't consequences and if there's a hazy border between excessive and acceptable, then what's the difference?
Right.
Excessive becomes the new acceptable.
What the courts need to do is remove that haziness. You need to make sure that your people are trained, make sure that the situations are well understood, make sure that the reason that this guy is pulling his gun on a suspect is because he needs to.
Yeah, which comes with holding officers accountable, which is not what's happening.
Absolutely. So they say the benefit of this immunity, officers would need to show that a reasonable person in their position wouldn't have known that their actions violated clearly established law. And I think that's probably the wrong. You need to have that measure, but you also need to prove that you were in a reasonable state of mind at that time too. If I look back at a situation like, for instance, we're almost there, but I'm going to jump ahead real quick to George Floyd. Okay. So George Floyd was ultimately executed, allegedly, because it hasn't been proven in court yet, by Officer Derek Chauvin. Now, if we look at Derek Chauvin, prior to this incident, he had 18 complaints on his official record, 2 of which ended in discipline, including letters of reprimand. He'd been involved in 3 police shootings, 1 of which was fatal. And he had had a reputation at a club that he was a bodyguard, a bouncer at, of using excessive force on minority crowds. How are you going to explain to me when you're dealing with a man who, by the way, George Floyd worked at the same club as a bouncer too? How are you going to explain to me that you're handling this individual with a record like that and that you're in a reasonable state of mind? You're not.
Not to mention that even what he won medals for involved killing people as well. I mean, sure, it was for a suspect that pointed a shotgun at him, a domestic violence incident where he broke down the door and shot at someone who reached for a pistol. In those things, he was probably at risk, but he still killed people and got rewarded for it, which in his own mind would be
fuels that mentality. Yeah. So, all right, let's step back a second. I wanted to talk about some examples of unjustified deadly force. And the first one, I think that really kicked off the awareness campaign in recent memory was Eric Garner, 17th of July, 2014. So he was allegedly selling illegal cigarettes on the streets of New York on Staten Island. He wasn't threatening anyone or being violent towards the officers. The officers attempted to make an arrest and wrestled Garner to the ground and then put him in a chokehold, which even at that time was an illegal hold for police. But they still employed it. Gardner repeatedly said he can't breathe. And this is where a lot of our Black Lives Matter movement comes from here. And that's why Black Lives Matter focuses on the choking of him at this point in time. So the officers continued to press his head into the ground and kept him in a chokehold. He suffered neck injuries and died because of these compressions. The case was considered to show police officers using illegal maneuvers and excessive force. However, neither of the officers involved were charged with a crime. The officer who put Garner in a chokehold was stripped of his badge and his gun, and the supervisor was charged with failure to supervise and stripped of her badge and gun. So you can kill someone. You just got to give up your badge and gun.
Right. And I think that's where a lot of the issues come in. They murdered him, you know? That's if it wasn't a cop, if it was anybody else, they would be going to jail. And I don't think they'd be able to get out of it. And I think I could be wrong, but there is footage of this, right? There is footage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's tough to watch, but I do think it is necessary to watch. Because you can see, you can read about this in the paper. You can read about, the excessive force. But when you see someone die from this, it gives you an entirely different perspective because it makes it real. And you see the casualness of it and how they're just holding him. Yeah. And then he's just gone, Yeah. And I think it's important that people see that. Well,
and there was an explosion of similar incidents like this afterwards, where chokeholds, became somehow a popular form of restraint. So let's, we're going to take a big leap here, and we're going to jump forward to George Floyd, which kind of spurred all of this. So I want to make sure we give him proper time. Now, George Floyd was a 46-year-old. He was killed by, as we said, Officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, George Floyd himself was not an angel, and I make no attempt to paint him as one. He had been charged with, I think, 8. He was charged 8 times for violent offenses between 1997 and 2005. So the man had a reputation, but after his last arrest, he was trying to turn things around. He was a hip-hop artist. He was a mentor in his religious community. He became more involved in Resurrection Houston at the time, which was a Christian church and ministry where he mentored young men. He helped his mother recuperate after she had a stroke. He delivered meals and assisted other projects with Angel by Nature Foundation. He became involved with a ministry that brought men from the Third Ward to Minnesota in a church work program with drug rehabilitation. And he had been involved in drugs and so forth. So he came from a difficult background, and he was a product of that background. His criminal background was tied up largely with that. But he had made a conscious decision to try to straighten things out in his life. And he winds up dying in the process of this entire incident. How does that make you feel as an individual?
I mean, there's a thing with, I see it a lot in like right-leaning media where they take his record and they use that to justify what happened to him. And it's not that some people are not black and white, like I mentioned earlier. No one's all good and no one's all bad. So what bothers me is when his record is brought up as a way to almost justify what happened to him. And it's not. Nothing should justify what happened to him. It was horrible. Again, I mentioned it with Eric Garner, but there's footage of what happened to George Floyd, and everybody should go and watch it because it's something that people need to see. It's horrible and it's slow. And you don't realize how long 8 minutes is until you're watching this man die in front of you. And his record doesn't. Obviously, it's important because he did things that were bad in his past, but he was trying to turn things around. And the initial thing happened because he was using a fake bill, right? Or a fake.
He had a counterfeit 20 that he was trying to pass off.
Doesn't mean he should be killed, Yeah. And we've seen so many between 2014 with Eric Garner and before up to George Floyd, so many of these cases where these men are just killed and nothing happens, but George Floyd proved to be different.
Well, and you're right. And I mentioned his record here just so that people understand what his background is.
No, I understand.
None of the 8 previous offenses he had had a death penalty associated with him. What he was involved with when he was accosted by police did not carry a death penalty. Yet he's dead at the hands of the police. And that really is what the problem is. You had 4 police officers on the scene at the time, 3 of them holding him down, 1 of them keeping the pedestrians back. Not one of them rendered assistance when he stopped breathing. When he was told, "I can't breathe," Chauvin told him, "Stop talking, that takes a lot of breath." No one checked the pulse. He was still being knelt on when the emergency services arrived to attend to him. That's a problem.
Yeah, and even if you make the officer can make the justification, I was just holding him down. He said he couldn't breathe, and you continued to do it.
And he was handcuffed already.
Yeah, right.
He was already restrained. What was he going to do?
There was no need. Obviously, there was no need for any of that. And it's good that, obviously, it's not good that he's dead, but it's good that everybody saw what happened and that it sparked something in a lot of people.
Absolutely. So a month later, we have Rayshard Brooks. 12th June 2020. A 27-year-old African-American was shot and killed by Atlanta police officer Garrett Rolfe. Officer Devin Brosnan responded to a complaint that Brooks was asleep in a car blocking a restaurant drive-through lane. Rolfe arrived after Brosnan radioed for assistance some minutes later. After a breathalyzer exam indicated that Brooks's blood alcohol content was above the legal limit for driving, Rolfe and Brosnan began to handcuff Brooks. Brooks scuffled with the officers, got a hold of Brosnan's taser, punched Rolfe, and ran. And if you watch this video, again, a lot of video. You had police body cam, you had pedestrian footage from cameras, from phones, and you had security footage from the Wendy's where this happened. The incident was fine up until Brooks ran. So with Rolfe pursuing him, Brooks turned to fire the taser toward Rolfe, who then shot Brooks twice in the back, and a third shot struck an occupied car. Brooks died after surgery. Footage of the incident from the officers' body cams, from witnesses' phones, and from the restaurant security cams were widely broadcast. Rolfe was fired, Brosnan was placed on administrative duty, and Police Chief Erica Shields resigned the following day. Based on the videos and witness reports, prosecutors claim, prior to a completed investigation by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, that after Brooks was shot, Rolfe kicked Brooks and Brosnan stood on his shoulder. Rolfe has been charged with felony murder and 10 other offenses, Brosnan with aggravated assault and 2 counts of violation of oath. This is a tough one in watching the incident here. It's clear that the suspect resisted arrest. I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. Wrestled a weapon away from the police and began to flee. That weapon, by the police's own definition, was a less than lethal weapon. He turned and discharged that weapon at the police, who responded with a lethal weapon. What's your reaction to that? I
haven't seen the footage of this one, so I just want to put that out there before I say anything else. It is a tough situation, and it's difficult because I don't know. Obviously, they should not have shot him twice in the back, right? But the fact that he was firing a weapon back at the officers makes it almost easier to spin it where it was justified this time, And I don't know. That's a difficult one. It's charged with felony murder. That's more than. Well, I think Chauvin got second degree? I think we have it here. Yeah. So it's interesting that response being so swift, I guess, right? Where it's a little bit more murky, whereas opposed to George Floyd, where that was pretty clear cut what happened there. It's interesting the different responses to these two situations.
Well, and I chalk that difference in response up to the fact that this was a month after the George Floyd case. So
it's a different world.
It was very heightened.
Mm-hmm.
The concern that I have is the situation in which that firearm was discharged did not meet the minimum criteria that have been required. Okay, the situation was the suspect was fleeing, did not have a deadly weapon, was not posing a threat to anyone else, even though he discharged a less than lethal weapon at the police. That basic premise of he was not a danger to someone else wasn't there. So, execute him as he ran away, I think kind of violates what that standard is.
Not to mention that the police also hit a occupied car, right?
And there's my other concern. So you're in a busy drive-through in a residential area, and you're indiscriminately firing your firearm 3 times, hitting the suspect twice. And what did you need the third shot for if you already hit him twice?
Yeah, that it could have been somebody relatively innocent could have been killed with no warning, really.
Yeah. We live in a very difficult time right now, as demonstrated by just these 3 incidents here. And I think the future is, if nothing else, there's going to be change. And we're running, we're already at the 1 hour mark, so we're a little late here, but I think the topic is worth spending the time on. Mm-hmm. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about where we think the future is going to go with this.
Insights into Entertainment, a podcast series taking a deeper look into entertainment and media. Our husband and wife team of pop culture fanatics are exploring all things from music and movies to television and fandom. We'll look at the interesting and obscure entertainment news of the week. We'll talk about theme park and pop culture news. We'll give you the latest and greatest on pop culture conventions. We'll give you a deep dive into Disney, Star Wars, and much more. Check out our video episodes at youtube.com/insightsintothings. Our audio episodes at podcast.insightsintoentertainment.com, or check us out on the web at insightsintothings.com.
So demonstrators have delivered a clear message in the days since George Floyd was killed about how America's police force has to change in the way they treat black people. And that change needs to happen now. Here's a partial list of some of the things that are changing right now as a result of these. So there's been changes to tactical rules. Dallas and Minneapolis have mandated officers intervene when a colleague is using excessive force. I'm not really sure what that means. They intervened when Chauvin was using excessive force on George Floyd. Of course, they intervened by restraining Floyd even further. So I'm curious to see what the details of those are. Seattle banned the covering of badge numbers so that, you could find out who these police were. They also banned chokeholds and tear gas. Minneapolis banned chokeholds. Houston banned chokeholds. The fact that these weren't banned before this, I think is kind of disturbing. New York banned chokeholds and repealed a law that sealed records of officer misconduct from the public. Not sure why that was in place. Philadelphia banned tear gas and other non-lethal methods. Connecticut has banned chokeholds and prohibited state emergency services from buying military-grade equipment from the federal government. Why local police need to buy military-grade equipment from the federal government? That's beyond me.
That's we can make a whole other show about that. And it's like we talk about excessive force. When you have access to this kind of equipment, it seems almost inevitable, right?
Yeah.
Why? And sure, if you're policing a high crime area, you might need better equipment to protect yourselves, but you don't need like assault rifles and tanks. Even my town, I live in a relatively small town. They bought like an APC like 2 years ago, and it's just ridiculous. And people did speak out about it then, but it's like, and when we get into defunding the police, these are the kind of things we talk about. You don't need the amount of money that they're getting.
Yep. So they're also talking about budget cuts and defunding the police. So Los Angeles has considered cutting police budget by up to $150 million. New York City has considered cutting, but hasn't disclosed specific numbers. Minneapolis, under defunding, Minneapolis' city council passed a resolution to replace its police department with a community-centric model. Now, that's an interesting concept in and of itself. This whole concept, before I go on my tirade, what are your thoughts on defunding the police?
I mean, I think it's definitely something that needs to happen. And I'm not saying people tend to take it and twist it as in we're going to get rid of all cops and you know, you're going to call 911 and no one's going to pick up, right? Not to mention that already happens sometimes in some places due to, you know, just how the area is spread out. But I think if groups like teachers and doctors, especially we just saw with the pandemic, don't have access to the resources they need to do their jobs effectively, which then has ripple effects for the rest of a community, doctors being people getting sick, teachers being education is, you know, not happening. I think that defunding of the police would help redistribute that money to programs that are better impactful and in the long run may reduce crime if people are better educated and have access to better medical care, you know?
And I think you're right. I think the important thing here is the concept of defunding the police is not disbanding the police.
Right.
The concept of defunding the police is a restructuring of what that dynamic is. Right now, like we mentioned earlier, you pick up the phone, call 911, you get a trained aggressor with a gun showing up at your door, regardless of what you're calling for. And that is not always the best thing for situations. The idea of having a community-centric model would have perhaps counselors that show up during a domestic dispute. So instead of having a police officer show up trying to resolve something that they're completely untrained to do, you've got people who are trained to diffuse these situations. You do not put a police officer in front of a hostage taker and expect them to resolve the situation. You put a hostage negotiator in front. They're specially trained to deal with these situations. So defunding the police is about changing how we respond. It's about taking assault rifles out of the police. You know, at no point in time should a police officer be walking the streets with assault rifles as they're providing protection to protesters. So when we say defund the police, it's not disband them.
Yeah. And there was a particularly, I don't know how much you watched the cable television, but of course Trump is taking this defund the police and running with it. There's a particularly terrible ad where it's someone calling 911 and it goes to an automated system. Yeah, dial 1 for murder, dial 2 for a home invasion. And then it cuts to like a burning city street and it's like, this is what's going to happen if you defund the police. That's just blatant misinformation.
Well, it is. And it's because Donald Trump just doesn't understand.
Yeah. And
Donald Trump is deliberately trying to manipulate what is a situation that is long in coming and long overdue. He's trying to manipulate that to ensure his own reelection.
And I don't want to fall down a Trump rabbit hole because it's so easy to do, but if we're trying to define what defund the police is, I think there's so much propaganda and misinformation, and I just want to make sure that we acknowledge them.
It is. And there have been successes in disbanding police, okay? I'll point to Camden, New Jersey, where Camden, New Jersey, the corruption was so rife in the police department that for years they tried to get to wean it out, and they couldn't. So eventually the city council disbanded the police. They had the state police come in and patrol, and then they went back and they rebuilt the police force. And one of the things that Camden is doing that is making it a success is there's a mandate by the chief of police in Camden that officers who come in and work in the police department have to walk the streets. They have to knock on doors. They have to talk to the residents on the street. They're building that relationship. It's a cooperative relationship that people have, and it's proving to be very effective in Camden at this point in time. The one criticism they have is that a lot of these police don't actually live in Camden, but that's something that can be resolved later. But moving on to things that are changing right now. So we have school contracts are getting canceled. So Minneapolis, Denver, and Portland have moved to end the presence of police officers in local schools. Not really sure that's a good idea given the number of school shootings that we've seen, but we'll see. Officers have a presence in 25 biggest school districts nationwide at this point in time. So we'll see where that goes. There's been a change to no-knock warrants There's been a ban in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was killed by police officers who raided her home with this type of warrant. So that was what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, they were undercover cops too, so it wasn't even clear that they were police. So she was killed, and then when her boyfriend tried to intervene, because they were not wearing uniforms, he tried to help. And again, I didn't want to bring her up because I don't have all the information, but he was either arrested or harmed as well.
So there's changes for that. So there's changes for police transparency. We spoke briefly about New York removing the ban, lockdown records on police officers who have been investigated for excessive force, so you can get that information. The one problem that we do run into is disciplinary hurdles, and you touched on this earlier talking about police unions. It's ridiculously hard to fire police officers in the U.S., let alone get criminal charges to stick. Chalk that up to unions, qualified immunity, weakness from elected officials, and it's a major roadblock to change. It's that bureaucracy that we're ingrained in. Minneapolis Police Department said that it is withdrawing from negotiations with its police union. The real effect of that is yet to be determined. So what we do at the end of the show here is we try to look at all the factors and give an educated guess where we think things are going. What do you think is going to happen? When do you think something's going to happen? And do you think that this is a lasting change? Or is this something that it's going to fade from the headlines and we're going to be right back in this position in months?
Well, I hope that it continues, and I hope that people continue to protest and that movements continue to happen. I do think that there is a pretty clear effort by the just general media to suppress the coverage of these protests. I mean, they focus on the looting instead of the peaceful protests that actually want change, and I think that is by design. And I hope that despite this discouragement, that these things continue to happen and people fight for change. And I do think, because we've seen so many cases of police officers using deadly force, killing particularly people of color, that are swept from the headlines. Trayvon Martin, things like that. But something about George Floyd and what happened afterwards feels different. People feel like they're talking about it more. And with the Black Lives Matter movement growing and getting backing from all types of people, whether it be celebrities or companies, however you want to take that, how genuine they are, I think it is hopefully going to affect more change in terms of defunding the police, in terms of making it easier to call officers out when they use excessive force and get them to face consequences for it.
I think you're absolutely right. I think change has been brewing for quite some time now. I think the environment is more than ready for it. I don't think we can survive too many more of these types of incidents without it really tearing the country apart. We, as a country, have this stain of how we've treated African Americans since before this country was founded. And we can't erase that stain. What we can do is we can help to prevent it from perpetuating itself moving forward. What we're doing today is very little different than what, the KKK was doing in the 1800s, lynching free black slaves. We're better than this as a country. We need to be better than this as a country. For the sake of the country and the sake of our children, we need to be better individuals. And we I can say that from a position of white privilege. And I am white privileged, and that is just by society's standards. But everyone should be free from the fear of ridiculous repercussions from the police. I've watched a number of podcasts on this subject already and news interviews and broadcasts, and the level of anxiety that I experience if I get pulled over by police pales in comparison to what an African American does. And We're talking some very affluent African Americans who get pulled over and are treated like criminals just by default. And that premeditated discrimination is what leads to these situations. And I think we're ready for a change. I think before we reach that change, I think we've got some work to do. Our current administration is not going to allow the changes that need to be happening. We need to have an administration change, whether it's in November or 4 years from November. I don't know, but I can tell you that under the current administration, we're not going to be allowed to do the things that we need to do to make things right, or to even start to make things right. Like I said, we can't erase that stain, so we can never make things right. What we can do is make things better. We can have a better future. And sadly, with the leadership that we have today, we're not going to be allowed to do that, because every effort that we make today is going to find unreasonable resistance from the administration. So we're probably months away from any real change, but I think society is going to demand that change regardless. So that's my 2 cents on it. Did you want to add anything?
Just like I said at the top of the hour, I do really think it's important to donate if you can. I know it's tough with the pandemic financially for everybody, but if you can donate to a lot of organizations, it's good. Sign petitions, even if you don't think it helps, it does, because it contributes to that social outcry. And especially if you're from a position of privilege, one of the biggest things you can do is have difficult conversations with people that you know. I've had to do it. Confront them about if they're casually racist or things like that. Confront them about their stance on police, if they advocate for police excessive force or for just racism in certain situations. You have to be the one to say something, because people aren't going to change because they see a news story, right? People are going to change because their friends and family say, hey, this is wrong. What you're seeing on TV, these people being killed, is wrong, you know? And I think that that's one of the ways that real change can be brought about.
Very well said. I agree with you 100%. I think that was all we had today. We did run a little bit late, but I definitely think it was a topic that was worth covering. Before we go, I do want to invite folks to check out our long-form articles on Medium. You can get those at medium.com/insightsintothings. We would love to hear feedback from you on what we're talking about, what your opinions are, and what you'd like to hear more of us talk more about. You can email us at comments@insightsintothings.com. You can get us on Twitter at insights_things. All of our videos are available on YouTube at youtube.com/insightsintothings, or you can get all of our content on our website at insightsintothings.com. And we do stream 6 days, in this case 7 days this week, on Twitch at twitch.tv/insightsintothings. Anything else you want to say before we go? Nope. All right. Then I think that's it. Another one in the books. Bye. For over 7 years, the Second Sith Empire has been the premier community guild in the online game Star Wars: The Old Republic. With hundreds of friendly and helpful active members, a weekly schedule of nightly events, annual guild meet and greets, and an active community both on the web and on Discord. The Second Sith Empire is more than your typical gaming group. We're family. Join us on the Starforge server for nightly events such as operations, flashpoints, World Boss hunts, Star Wars trivia, Guild Lottery, and much more. Visit us on the web today at www.thesecondsithempire.com.
Insightful podcasts by informative hosts. Insights into Things, a podcast network. Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow, where we take a deeper look into how the issues of today will impact the world of tomorrow. From politics and world news to media and technology, we discuss how today's headlines are becoming tomorrow's reality.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow, Episode 8, Voter Suppression. My name, as your temporary host for today, is Sam Whalen. I'm joined by my co-host, Joseph Whalen.
Thank you, Sam. And if you do a good enough job, it might not be temporary.
We will see what happens. Before we get to today's topic, just a couple of things I want to mention. Make sure to subscribe to us on all your podcast services. That includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and anywhere else you get your podcasts around the globe. Most importantly, if you are watching on Twitch or watching the rebroadcast and you have Amazon Prime, that means you have Twitch Prime, so you can give us the Twitch Prime subs, and they do help us out a lot. Contact information, if you want to email us, you can email us at comments at I'll just try that again. Comments at insightsintothings.com. Twitter, we are at insights_things. We can find the video on YouTube at youtube.com/insightsintothings. Like I said, we are streaming 6 days a week on Twitch, twitch.tv/insightsintothings. Audio is going to be on podcast.insightsintoentertainment.com, Facebook, Insights Into Things podcast. And finally, links to all these, if you missed any of them, are on www.insightsintothings.com. Thank you so much for watching.
Let me correct one thing there. It's actually the audio's podcast.insights into tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Insights in Entertainment is our other show.
Oh, oops. Well, support all the shows. But for this one, Insights into Tomorrow.
There we go.
It's a mistake on my notes there. So getting into today's topic, we are talking about voter suppression. It is a big topic in the news, so we thought it would be pertinent to cover it. So going over to my co-host, what do you think when you think of voter suppression? What comes to mind for you?
Well, I mean, if I just rip it right out of the headlines at this point in time, it seems to be today interference with the U.S. Postal Service, since we're going to be depending on mail-in voting during the pandemic. But it's a sadly, much richer, deeper history than just what we're seeing today. Even going back to the technology-related stuff from the 2016 election with the emails and the hacking and everything else. So it's much more complicated than what we're seeing today. And what we're seeing today is some pretty sophisticated voter suppression technique.
Yep. Like you mentioned what we're going through today, what's going on in the past, and that's what we're going to do here today. We're going to break things down from the past, the present, and then go ahead and look at the future. So starting off, according to Wikipedia, which I know professors out there are going to get me for citing that, but I think it's a pretty good definition. It says voter suppression in the United States concerns allegations about various efforts, legal and illegal, used to prevent eligible voters from exercising their right to vote. So these things can vary depending on the place, the state, or the method. A lot of the voter suppression is tied directly to voting rights, which started at the beginning of democracy itself. Initially, we'll actually touch on that later. I got mixed up there, so that's just a tease for the past. The current state of voter suppression, we'll look at what President Trump is doing, how he's dealing with the Postal Service, like you mentioned, and how he's using tactics of fear during this pandemic to sort of encourage people how to use their votes and what might happen, and how he's using that to his advantage. And finally, we'll look at the future of things. The 2020 election, what that effect might have on voter apathy, which has been a problem for many years, and how voting laws might be able to change, or how we can hope they can change to allow more people to be able to vote. And so we'll get with the past in just a minute when we come right back. So, like I mentioned when I accidentally started to go into the history of things, the history of voting rights goes all the way back to the beginning of American democracy. According to the people over at howstuffworks.com, quote, the U.S. Constitution does not explicitly include a right to vote, which is true. Only the House of Representatives were to be elected by the people, according to the Constitution. So that was where we, the people, could express their right to vote. However, these people were not all people, as you may be imagining. At first, only white, male property owners were able to vote. And that included some free black men later on when slavery was abolished. But even still, which we'll get into later, there were restrictions in place to discourage free black men from voting. Quote, all women, non-African American minorities, and many non-Christian religious groups were denied the franchise. So as you can see here, right from the beginning of the history of voting in America, immediately people were excluded and their votes were suppressed. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's kind of a unfortunate statement that we legislated voter suppression from the day that this company was started. So there's always been this underlying idea that only certain people should have a say in who is elected and how our government is formed. Now, that's changed significantly over years, but what we've seen is a evolution of the legal disenfranchisement of people. And I don't know, maybe I'm idealistic by thinking that over 200 years later, we might finally have it right, but it seems like we still aren't doing what we need to do in order to get people the ability to vote.
Yeah, so following the Civil War, there was the era of Reconstruction, which was basically the country trying to put itself back together. You had a lot more free blacks in the South gaining sources of power for a little while until a lot of that was done away with the Dixiecrats in 1877, when the imposing of Jim Crow laws, which were designed to specifically restrict the black vote in the South and in other places. In addition to that, the 15th Amendment allowed voting regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Ideally, unfortunately, as we see with these Jim Crow laws, things like literacy test, poll taxes, and straight violence or intimidation were employed to discourage African Americans to vote. And those literacy tests, a lot of free blacks did not know how to read because they were never taught. And poll taxes, a lot of them were economically disenfranchised as well. So that also excluded them from the right to vote. According to, again, the people at How Things Work, quote, only 3% of voting age African American Southerners were registered to vote in 1940. So this is well after, almost 100 years after the Civil War ended. Excuse me. And still only 3% of voting age African American Southerners were registered to vote. Now, in 1965, jumping ahead in the timeline, we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which did do away with a lot of the Jim Crow laws and allowed women and minority votes to open up, which did help to make voting more equal and allow more of the people to expand that definition. However, this story doesn't end there. As anyone that studied history knows, racism and oppression did not just simply disappear with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. New voter suppression methods are still in use today. Common modern voter suppression techniques, there are voter registration problems. So if you can't register to vote, you can't vote at all. So not all states require registration. There's also confusion on where and when to register and confusion over what you need to register. So different documents and qualifications can change state to state, which if people don't have access to something like a birth certificate or a passport, either by financial reasons or just a lack of it, then that's going to stop them from being able to vote. Voter purges. These laws vary state by state. States can purge voters from registration if they haven't voted in as few as 2 years. Purge is done selectively to disenfranchise minority groups. So we'll touch more on later voter apathy, and this plays directly into that. Basically, if you haven't voted in 2 years, they can nullify your vote, which presidential elections are every 4 years. And there's a case to be made there that that 2-year limit might be intentional because I'd say the biggest election is the presidential election. That's what most people vote in, ideally. So by doing it every 2 years, you're going to be able to wipe out a lot of voters that would then need to re-register, which we just touched on could be difficult for different people. What are your thoughts on just these early, more subtle ways of getting people to taking away the ability to vote?
Well, and I think a lot of it is the convenience factor, what we're talking about here. The need, there's a certain requirement that you have to have because everyone's always very worried about voter fraud. That's what's getting thrown out now. So you come up with laws that on the face of them are intended to combat voter fraud, but really the underlying purpose is to make it inconvenient and difficult for people to register or to get to the polls and vote. And the one thing that your typical politicians don't want is an educated, energetic, and enthusiastic voting population. The fewer votes they have to worry about is the less effort they have to make in order to influence those votes. So by cutting back that number, and all of these laws really are designed to do that, is to cut back that number of voters, it makes it easier for them. If they can control certain segments of the population, like if they can get 50% of the population in Louisiana to not vote, well, then they don't need to spend money campaigning down there. All they have to do is get them to not vote. Because if they're not voting for me, then they're not voting for my opponent either. Then, just as an economic equation, they can go spend that money someplace else. And as a result, the citizens of the country lose out as a result.
Yep, absolutely. And as we often end up to the conclusion on the show, always follow the money. That's typically where you'll go. So yeah, definitely moving those funds around can help their campaigns. Going back to the more the modern ways of voter suppression, strict voter ID and ballot requirements. So these laws, again, vary state by state. Some states require government-issued IDs to vote, and this was a big thing in the news a while back, voter ID laws, and it's still a very important issue, especially with the upcoming election. But basically, these impede low-income, disabled, and immigrant residents who may not be able to get a government-issued ID, whether it be because of a physical disability, a lack of money, or immigration status in general. In addition to that, voter confusion, misinformation from political parties to confuse voters, messaging from official and unofficial polling can be confusing and inconsistent, incorrect ballots invalidate voters' choices. We had a little bit of that with Bush and Gore in the 2000 election, I think. Somewhere around there?
Sure.
Earlier than that, maybe. But yeah, the hanging Chad with the miscounted ballots.
Yep.
So even if you get your vote in, it might just be counted wrong, And we don't really have that as much of an issue today because that incident did make different methods of voting that were more secure, more popular. There is still instances of voter intimidation and harassment. Racially motivated scare tactics are employed to prevent citizens from voting. Fake robocalls from hate groups pretending to be candidates, and inappropriate questioning at polling locations to intimidate voters. I mean, there's incidents of this up into the 2012 election with Barack Obama, groups going around trying to intimidate people of color from voting to help sway the vote in the other side. Poll closures and long lines. This one pretty much speaks for itself. If the polls are closed, then nobody can go there to vote. And again, it goes back to what you said about inconvenience, right? I mean, if you have to walk, if you've got no way to transport yourself and you have to walk 5 miles to the polling station and you get there and it's closed, you're not going to walk 25 miles to the next one. And that's kind of a common theme here. You'll see a lot of these laws and tactics are specifically targeting people less fortunate in life, whether that be minorities or people financially less well off. Malfunctioning voting equipment, so sometimes things will be tampered with, whether that be the voting machines or the external attacks of computerized voting, now that most things are electronic, those can be targeted as well. So disenfranchisement of justice-involved individuals. So felons, approximately 6 million Americans, are barred from voting due to felony convictions that disenfranchise them. So if you're convicted of a felony, any felony, you cannot vote in this country. And that excludes 6 million Americans from being able to vote. And again, the laws vary state by state, and I'm sure that we could probably make a whole show about the ethics of whether felons should be able to vote. I personally think they should, because even if you are a terrible felon of some degree, I don't think it should be a clear-cut line of no matter what you did, as long as you're marked felon, you cannot vote. I think it's not as black and white as that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I have kind of a fundamentalist view on this, in that in order to have a civilized society in which citizens vote for the type of government that they want, there are laws, and you have to abide by those laws. And once you choose to no longer abide by those laws, you have to sacrifice a certain amount of protection that you would get under a society like that. And one of those protections, I think, really should be your voting. You know, if you are a convicted felon, you've chosen to not abide by society's laws, so you shouldn't be able to take part in shaping those laws at that point. Now, that's not to say that if you're a convicted felon, do your time, come out, and you're reformed, you shouldn't be able to vote. I think you should. But I don't think we should be rolling voting machines into a prison where people have chosen to not abide by their civic duty by being law-abiding citizens, because they're not the kind of people that I want voting people into office, because they're going to vote people into the office that are going to be most advantageous to them, which by definition is least advantageous to a civilized society. But that's just my personal opinion.
No, that's understandable. I mean, if, like you said, if they're the felons that are still serving their time and have committed horrible crimes, then no, they shouldn't be able to vote. But then it's when you run into the people that have served their time but are still marked as felon, that those people also being excluded, it makes you wonder where that line is drawn.
And I agree with you 100%. Yeah. Like the purpose of our penal system is to punish but reform. And if you're reformed to the point that we can put you back into everyday society, then you should be reformed to the point that you should be able to vote and be a participating member of society again. It's a fundamental right.
Absolutely. So we do have one more tactic here. We've got gerrymandering, which is politicians manipulate voting redistricting in ridiculous ways to shape the voting pools. This is a pretty blatant attempt to manipulate the voting population and has direct and lasting impact on election results. So you can look up pictures of this where districts are, I mean, they're literally maps of locations, and they're drawn in such a way that a certain politician will be able to get more votes because of the way the district is drawn. And it's changing and moving these lines around, which is done constantly, that allows for votes to be moved around and pulled in certain areas. And it's like we have here, a blatant attempt to manipulate the voting population, and an all too popular one. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll get into the current conditions and the source and symptoms of how voter suppression is used today.
Before we jump out, though, I did want to mention, a different view on gerrymandering. While it's definitely something that's used to manipulate voter bases, I think it really epitomizes what most of our problems are with voter suppression right now. And that is, one, your ability to elect people into office, the legal rights of that vary so much from state to state, especially when you're electing someone of a federal office, a senator, a congressman, or a president. The laws in your local area can vary significantly from across the country, which is one of the problems. There's no consistency in the law. The other is that gerrymandering highlights probably the biggest problem we have, and that is the people that are making the laws for how we vote and how we elect politicians are the very politicians that are affected by them. So as a result, you have to assume, quite rightly, that the lawmaking when it comes to this type of event is going to be advantageous first and foremost to the politicians and not the citizens. So to me, that's why it was perfect having gerrymandering last, because it really rolls up all the problems that we have and symbolizes it in one single thing there, even though that itself is its own problem.
Yeah, definitely. And it really, I mean, obviously we're pretty cynical on this show, but all these tactics made by the people in power, specifically designed to keep them in power and to prevent voting, is so contrary to what you'd think the typical American view of democracy is, where everybody gets a say, everybody gets an equal say, and your vote matters. And clearly, as we're seeing here, your vote is manipulated and controlled in a variety of ways, not the least of which is moving maps and changing maps to get more power, to either prevent or to corral your vote. And it's anti-American in a way, really.
Everyone is equal, but there are those who are more equal than others.
Exactly. And as we'll see coming up, we have some specific examples of some of the methods we just mentioned that we will highlight that are more concrete examples of voter suppression.
All right, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Insights into Teens, a podcast series exploring the issues and challenges of today's youth. Talking to real teens about real teen problems. Explore issues from braces to puberty, social anxiety to financial responsibility. Each week, we talk about the topics concerning today's youth. We look at how the issues affect teens, how to cope with these issues, and how parents, friends, and loved ones can help teens handle these challenges. Check out our video episodes on youtube.com/insightsintothings. Catch our audio versions on podcast.insightsintoteens.com or on the web at insightsintothings.com.
Welcome back, everybody. If you're just tuning in, we are talking about voter suppression today. We just got through the history and some of the more modern techniques used to do it, and we're going to get into some more real-world examples of how it worked. So, in one of the most important tactics used for voter suppression is the use of disinformation, and that is a very broad umbrella thing that is used to manipulate everybody in a variety of ways nowadays. But with voter suppression, it comes down to the highly popular and effective modern methods used. So in 2008, the 2008 elections, Democrats in Nevada received robocalls informing them that they could vote on November 5th. This was a day after the election, to avoid the long lines. So basically, all these people in Nevada got fake calls telling them a fake date for the real election. And this did impact the amount of votes that came in Nevada, because a bunch of people showed up the next day to vote for an election that was already over and already won. So what are your thoughts on this example? Have you experienced any kind of robocalls for voting?
I have not. Somehow I've managed to get off of all the calling lists for robocalls. And I think it's probably because a couple that I had in the past did not end well for the caller. I don't take political ads very well when people bother me with them. Although I'm getting hammered with spam. I will say that, because it's so much easier to get through to people. But this is exactly the tactics that I was referring to earlier, where if they can get those numbers down, then it's so much easier for them to control the people that they know they can get their votes from. And a lot of times the people that they target are the lower income, lesser privileged individuals, because those are an unknown quantity to politicians. Politicians like guarantees. And the people that are willing to commit to funding their campaign and contributing to their campaign or showing up to their rallies, they're the ones that they know they don't have to convince them. But the people that are lower income people can't afford to contribute to campaigns, so they don't have a list of, these people as known good people. So let's just make sure they don't vote at all. We'll grab the smaller group that we know we have, and we'll run with that. So this is a very typical technique I'd expect to see.
Yeah, and again, like you just mentioned, we're seeing more of that targeting of people that are less financially well off or minority groups, and it goes hand in hand with the voter suppression we're seeing today. Speaking of today, it's difficult to talk about this without mentioning President Trump. And if you've been reading the news or staying current with the news, most recently, President Trump went on Fox Business Network and explicitly noted 2 funding provisions that Democrats are seeking in a relief package that has stalled on Capitol Hill. Trump said without the additional money, the Postal Service won't have the resources to handle a flood of ballots from voters who are seeking to avoid polling places during the coronavirus pandemic. This is courtesy of ABC7.com. So this is the big reason we wanted to talk about this topic today. President Trump has been very vocal about his distrust in mail-in ballots and his efforts to dismantle the Postal Service and discredit them have been enormous, to say the least. So now, in this most recent interview, Trump, his quote is, "If we don't make a deal, that means they don't get the money," he told host Maria Bartiromo. Sorry if I mispronounced that name. He goes on to say, quote, "That means they can't have universal mail-in voting, they just can't have it," end quote. So Trump is essentially admitting there that he is intentionally withholding funds from the Postal Service to prevent the ability for people to mail in their votes, which is going to be a critical way of collecting votes during the coronavirus pandemic coming up in the November election. What are your thoughts on his comments here?
Well, I actually, and you mentioned earlier that we're cynical here, and we probably are, but I think the actions of our politicians warrant it at this point. I can't help but think that this goes much deeper than just the U.S. Postal Service, because these threats against the U.S. Postal Service wouldn't work if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic where people were afraid to go to public polling places. So if you step back and take a look at it from a 30,000-foot standpoint, you have to wonder, was the whole COVID-19 pandemic manufactured to set up this ability to suppress voters now? Because the voting suppression technique, because the first thing he did was come out and tell us over and over without a single piece of evidence that mail-in voting was ripe for fraud. There's no evidence because it's never been done before. What we do have evidence of is absentee ballots, and the fraud percentage of absentee ballots is minuscule.
Yeah, I actually have a number here, just really quick. In the past 20 years, 0.00006% of all mail-in ballots cast were fraudulent. Quote, "There is no support for the argument that mail-in voting is a problem." This comes from Lorraine Midnight, a political science professor at Rutgers University. So there's your statistic right there.
Right.
It's a negligible number in the past 20 years of mail-in ballots that were fraudulent.
Right. So his first claim that it's fraud didn't pan out. Right. You tell a lie big enough and often enough, people start to believe it. Well, no one believed this one because there was so much supporting evidence to shoot it down. So now he knows that he can't set this up as a legal challenge to say, oh, it's fraud. So instead, he switches to his next tactic of, well, let's just make sure people can't do it. I can't legally do it. He can't legally stop people from doing the mail-in voting, especially when you have governors who are already sending the ballots out. So he declares a state of emergency so that he can defund the post office. Now, just to put things into perspective right now, he declares a state of emergency so he can sign an executive order that allows him to basically shut the Postal Service down to a certain extent to impede people's ability to mail in ballot. We have over 165,000 people dead in this country now as a result of the COVID-19 virus, and we still haven't gotten a state of emergency declared on that. So to me, it's painfully obvious that our current administration is employing tactics that we would expect to see from third world petty dictators to try to hold on to power. And right now, to a large extent, his opponents, the Democrats, are powerless to stop him because they only control part of the Senate and Congress. I think it's important to note that should Donald Trump get reelected, even to another 4 years, after those 4 years, or even after this election, Donald Trump is out of the political spotlight. He has no political ties. He has no political backers. He has no political control. He has only what he has right now. So as a result, all of these Republicans that are hitching their wagons to Donald Trump and defending him and supporting him through all these clearly illegal actions are going to be left high and dry. Whether it's after this election or the next, they still need to get reelected. And when you choose the wrong side of history and you do it in such a spectacularly public way, it's going to come back. There's going to be a toll that has to be paid for that. And that's going to be in the number of seats that the Republicans will see in the Senate moving forward when Donald Trump isn't around anymore. Now, I don't want to turn into a political consultant here or anything like that, but the point I'm trying to make here is that we have a president here who really is employing tactics that they've gone beyond questionable. I mean, they were questionable 4 years ago. Now they're downright illegal. And you have Congress feels like it's powerless to do anything about it. And if Congress feels that way, how do you think the average voting American feels? And that in and of itself is a form of voter suppression.
Yeah, exactly. And it's definitely, I think that's one of the biggest things we're dealing with today. And voter apathy comes right with that. We see a president doing whatever he wants with basically no repercussions or limits, blatantly making moves to ensure his power for whoever knows how long, suppressing votes, and then telling reporters, yeah, I'm doing this on purpose and it's working. And voter apathy was already a big issue in this country. I don't have the exact numbers, but I know that in the past couple presidential elections, voter numbers have been going down because people feel like their votes don't matter. And especially in 2016 with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, when it was Trump got the Electoral College to declare him the winner. And I think that was a really harsh blow to the voting fervor in America, because Hillary Clinton got the popular vote and lost.
Well, and that's not the first time that's happened in history. That happened in 2000 as well when Bush, took office, and Al Gore had the popular vote, and it's happened in the past.
Yeah.
But every time it has happened, people feel disenfranchised. People start to question whether we really need the Electoral College because, yeah, we needed it 150, 200 years ago because of the limitations that we had. Do we really need it now? But, it's going to take an act of Congress and a constitutional amendment to do away with it. So that's not going to happen. But you still have people that are left wondering, why should I vote?
Yep. Yeah, and that's, as you said, another form of voter suppression. So moving on, there's this documentary on, I believe it's on Netflix, right?
Netflix, yeah.
Called The Great Hack, and it deals with Facebook, Cambridge analytical data scandal. It's a good watch. If it's a little leaning to one side, but I think it's still very informative. It came out end of last year, I think, November, October. Yeah. So essentially, it details how the Trump campaign engaged with Cambridge Analytica, which is a tech company, a data analyst company, to micro-target and influence the 2016 election. Cambridge Analytica was employed to influence elections in over 30 countries prior to the 2016 election. These countries include the United States, the United Kingdom, Argentina, Colombia, Guyana, sorry about that, and Uruguay. Right? Uruguay?
Sure, close enough.
I was never very good at geography. Sorry to those people if you are listening from those countries. So if you do watch this documentary, it pretty blatantly shows, it details what Cambridge Analytica does and how they composite user profiles based on data that people use in any aspect of life, mostly on social media or what they buy online shopping. And they compile all this data and they make it so that people can be targeted more effectively to vote on either side of a political party. So if you like a lot of posts that are left-leaning, then Cambridge takes that data and targets you with more left-leaning ads to further you down that line of thinking. And the same thing with the right. So I think using all that data to further influence people on a larger level is extremely dangerous, and in itself is a form of suppression, because you're being closed-minded. You're being sealed off from other ways of thinking because you're just being further down this rabbit hole to think a certain way. And I think with the rise of how important social media is, especially with President Trump having such an active Twitter account and such a wide social media following, I think these things go hand in hand. And the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal is a clear example of that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, and I give Cambridge Analytica total props, because what they did really was brilliant. They managed to convince Facebook to give them access to all this user information. And it wasn't just a matter of figuring out how to convince someone to vote for a candidate that they wouldn't usually do, which is difficult in and of itself. But they have a storied history in appealing to certain populations with this micro-targeting that they do. And there was one campaign, I believe it was Bolivia. I don't remember entirely, but I think it was Bolivia. It was a Central American, South American country. And the opponent employed Cambridge Analytica to come in to reduce the number of votes for their opponent. They weren't even trying to win votes, because they knew that they had a guaranteed percentage of the population. And they knew all they had to do was to convince a certain portion of the population to not vote. Just don't show up. So Cambridge Analytica used this data from Facebook to bombard a certain young voting population in this country, to basically think, oh, well, it's the cool thing not to vote. Only the old people vote. Only the privileged vote. We're not going to vote. And it convinced enough people to just not show up and vote. Whether they were going to vote for one candidate or the other, the risk that they could have voted for their opponent was all that they needed to stop them from voting. And when this percentage of the population didn't vote, they didn't feel like they were being suppressed. They didn't feel like they were being taken advantage of. They thought they were doing what the cool thing was to do. And that's the psychological advantage that companies like Cambridge Analytica have when they have this data. We make references to comic book references and scenarios a lot of times. And this makes me think of what was it? Captain America.
Oh, Winter Soldier?
Winter Soldier.
Yeah, where they have the shield helicarriers that have all the data and they look at potential targets.
Right.
It's like Minority Report, too. Yeah.
But you have Zola's algorithm.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what they had, was they had this magical algorithm that churned all this data and told them who they had to go after and what they had to do. And it worked. The candidate that hired Cambridge Analytica won the election.
Yep.
And it's really something as simple as that, the psychological warfare that they employ, that makes them so dangerous.
Yeah, I think, and you can still see that today, really. I mean, if you get into any kind of social media, like I said before, rabbit hole, where you're exploring, and I'll do that from time to time. Like I'm definitely more left-leaning, so I'll try to go to more right-leaning Twitter accounts, and I follow and I go further and further, and I try to see their point of view and I try to look at those ideas. And you see this kind of manipulation there, whether it be from what I think are real people or just Twitter bots. And Twitter's very particularly bad with it, where there's just bots that just tweet things that are, taking this data and just spitting out words. But this informational suppression and closing off is still apparent today, and it's still unfortunately effective. And I think we are seeing it again with the 2020 election. Yeah. So going back to some of the things we mentioned earlier in terms of modern voter suppression, we touched on it a little bit, but the voter ID legislation, is still very important. This is courtesy of the American Civil Liberties Union. According to them, millions of Americans lack ID. 11% of U.S. citizens, or more than 21 million Americans, do not have government-issued photo identification. So right out of the gate, you have 11% of the population, 21 million people that do not have government-issued photo IDs for whatever reason. And when it comes to voter ID laws, from the get-go, if you don't have a government-issued ID, you can't vote. So that's 21 million people that are simply excluded for one reason or another for not having an ID. Obtaining ID costs money. Even if ID is offered for free, voters must incur numerous costs, such as paying for birth certificates to apply for a government-issued ID. And these costs, while they may seem small to some people, for someone living paycheck to paycheck or that has to support a family, these costs can add up. And when you speak about that voter apathy, those things can sometimes go hand in hand. Well, I need to get a government ID. Well, that's going to cost me $150. That's food for my kids for a week, you know?
Yeah.
So that's stopping some people right there. Underlying documents required to obtain ID cost money, like I just said, a significant expense for lower income Americans. The combined cost of document fees, travel expenses, and waiting time can be anywhere from $75 to $175. So that can be a significant sum of money to a lot of people. The travel required is also a major burden. This can be with people with disabilities, the elderly, or those in rural areas that don't have access to public transportation. Specifically in Texas, some people in rural areas must travel approximately 170 miles to reach the nearest ID office, which if you don't have a car, that's highly unlikely you're going to travel 170 miles on foot.
But those numbers aren't really unusual for Texas. I mean, Texas is a geographic anomaly. You're a half hour from everything in Texas at least.
Definitely. So what are your thoughts on these restrictions and how they can impact the elderly or people without the financial backing?
They're definitely legitimate concerns. My mother was one who never drove, so she never needed a government ID. So when she was told she needed one to register to vote, voting wasn't important to her at that point in time. The only time she wound up getting ID was when she had to open a bank account at one of the local banks, and they required her to have a voter ID or a photo ID. And she had to jump through hoops because you don't have a lot of the same documentation you would normally need in order to obtain those IDs. You look at in New Jersey itself, we need I don't know what the point system is now, but you have to generate documents that are equal to a certain number of points. Well, some of those documents are things that immigrants wouldn't have. You know, if you immigrated here legally from another country, you might not have your birth certificates or your baptismal records or any of the stuff from a country you may have been fleeing from because you're trying to avoid the oppression. You might not have bills in your name. If you live with family, one of a series of documents you could get in New Jersey were any bills that were billed, utility bills, phone bills, gas bills, water bills, that type of thing. Well, if you're a recent immigrant to the country and you can't afford your own home, you may be living with someone and all the bills are in their name, so you can't use those as a form of ID. So this is one of those ones where they use the whole idea of, let's throw out voter fraud. Okay, well, if you can't prove you are who you are, then you shouldn't be allowed to vote because it's going to cause fraud. When statistically speaking, the fraud numbers are insignificantly low. But that's the impetus for using voter ID is to one, scare people from voting. Because if you don't have a voter ID and you walk into a hall, it terrifies people because you're going to be asked for something you don't have. And the reaction that you get, especially in today's volatile law enforcement police environment, that could lead to significant issues that you run into. So that scares people away in and of itself. Not even the fact that I can't even get one of these because I don't have the documentation that's needed, but because we could throw out we can link through some theoretical justification voter fraud with voter ID, then we can justify segmenting that portion of the population off and denying them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you kind of made me think of something. I think on this show before I mentioned the concept of how there always has to be an other, right? There always has to be some kind of enemy or some kind of idea to rally people against, whether that be for good or evil. And I think that voter fraud is that other for this, because as you said, the numbers on actual voter fraud are insignificant almost. But the concept of voter fraud, that the worst thing you can do as an American is vote and lie about it, or not vote at all and pretend you're somebody else. When in reality, by using the concept of voter fraud to deter people from voting is the really anti-democracy thing. And it's these levels of mental chess, of manipulation of an entire population of people, and getting it in their head that either your vote doesn't matter or the biggest threat to your democracy is this other. And it's dangerous, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's hard to dig through the vines of all these manipulations. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and look at the future of voter suppression.
Insights into Entertainment, a podcast series taking a deeper look into entertainment and media. Our husband and wife team of pop culture fanatics are exploring all things from music and movies to television and fandom. We'll look at the interesting and obscure entertainment news of the week. We'll talk about theme park and pop culture news. We'll give you the latest and greatest on pop culture conventions. We'll give you a deep dive into Disney, Star Wars, and much more. Check out our video episodes at youtube.com/insightsintothings. Our audio episodes at podcast.insightsintoentertainment.com, or check us out on the web at insightsintothings.com.
Welcome back, everybody. We are going to get into the future and potential solutions for how to combat voter suppression. So this article comes from Rolling Stone, and it's just some of the comments that President Trump has made, again, regarding voter suppression and his thoughts on his lawsuits at the time. So in the 2020 election, which is the big thing we have coming up, the RNC has filed over $20 million worth of lawsuits dealing with voting. This is a quote from Rolling Stone. Some attempt to block litigation brought by Democratic groups to expand mail-in voting in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Others seek to invalidate state-level policies by saying that expanding access to mail-in ballots invites fraud. So this is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, how there's this wide effort to discredit mail-in voting. And right here you have the number of $20 million worth of lawsuits dealing with voting. And again, it's the blatant evidence of what President Trump and the administration and the Republican Party in general are doing to discredit mail-in voting. So what are your thoughts on the $20 million worth of lawsuits against this?
I can't help but think how many mailboxes that would pay for to keep on the street.
Yeah.
$20 million.
Yep.
But you're right. I mean, we have not only do we have blatant attempts to impede voters from voting, this is the first administration who's ever come out publicly on national television and invited foreign powers to interfere in an American election. How that itself is not treasonous and treated as such, it blows my mind. But when that was not effective enough for him to maintain the numbers that he thought he needed in the polls, which he's still 12 points down, by the way, in the recent Reuters poll, he stepped up the game. So now we're literally pulling mailboxes off the street 3 months in advance of the election. We have sorting machines that are being broken down. We have instructions being given to the Postmaster General that would deliberately make it difficult to count and handle the volume required for mail-in voting. How this is not a criminal offense is beyond me. It really is. And I hope and I pray, and I'm not a very religious individual, but I pray that should the Democrats come out on top in this election, that we don't do something really bad like grant immunity or a pardon to Trump for what he's doing to this country, because this is destroying the country more than anything any outside force has ever done. I've lived through, you've lived through 9/11. We lived through riots. We've lived through, the country has lived through a civil war. And I think what's happening today with how we're treating our democracy and our government is far more dangerous than even the Civil War was. And it's frightening. It really is.
Yeah.
It makes me feel very apprehensive for you and tomorrow's generation and the rest of the younger generation in this country right now. It's terrifying.
Yeah, it's definitely a scary prospect, and hopefully, and maybe everything we've covered today might say to the contrary, but hopefully our vote will still matter and our voices will still matter, and that won't go away. And we'll probably touch more on that when we get to our closing statements in just a little bit. But going back to this Rolling Stone article, Rick Hasen, a University of California Irvine law professor and author of Election Meltdown, says the goal of these lawsuits is to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election, raising spurious fraud claims. So just like we just talked about, the goal is to discredit and disenfranchise and spread disinformation. And speaking of that disinformation, a big common theme has been the use of COVID-19 to stir up fear of the election being in danger, when in reality, these precautions are being taken to save lives, not to harm them. So things like social distancing, the use of mail-in voting, and we've touched on this mostly for the most part already. But basically, there's things being done for COVID-19 are being spun by members of the Trump administration as harming democracy, when in reality, it is, the administration that is the one doing that. Specifically, the group has run ads that warn against risky new methods like mail-in ballots and accuse Wisconsin Democrats of sowing election, quote, chaos after the state's Republicans refused to send every voter an absentee ballot or delay its primary election because of COVID-19. Again, this is from that Rolling Stone article. So in Wisconsin, you're seeing direct targeting of the Wisconsin Democrats because of how they had to handle things because of COVID-19. And in reality, it's not about, it seemed like it was meant to save lives, to prevent the disease from spreading, but it was taken and spun for political gain, which is horrible. And unfortunately, it might have worked for some people.
Well, and I think a lot of what we're seeing out of the current administration is for political gain. The Trump administration still doesn't want to admit we have an issue. Every time Donald Trump addresses any media organization regarding COVID-19, we're told, oh, it's getting better. We're doing great. We're doing fine. The numbers are coming down. And being cynical again, I've come to expect lies from all politicians. More so from Donald Trump. I think he's statistically told more lies and misinformation in office than any other president in the time he's been in office, which is provable. But this series of lies are so blatant and so easily proven wrong that it's almost like he's daring people to challenge him on this. His own administration is having difficulty combating some of the misinformation that he's putting out. It changes. The administration policy statements change multiple times over a 24-hour period because the administration officials come up with a policy. They put Trump in front of the camera, and Trump, it's like short attention span theater. He can't stay on point for more than 5 seconds before he goes off on one of his tirades and one of his rants, and it's counter to what the administration is. So, and he's popular. He very frequently throws out the term of fake news. And it's ironic that he's generating more fake news about everything than is being generated about him. So the messaging itself, the obvious attempts at disinformation, the fact that if something controversial comes up, he's very quick to generate another manufactured controversy over here. Everyone pay attention to the new controversy over here, and we'll all ignore what was going on. He's a master manipulator when it comes to that. Like it's almost like sleight of hand in a magician, and he's constantly misdirecting people. And the press and America, and I'm sad to say this, are so stupid that they continuously fall for it. And that's why we're in the position that we're in now. Because we're all falling for this misinformation. And until people have the wherewithal to step back and to objectively look at the statements and the claims and do their own research, we're sheep. And that's where one of the biggest problems is today.
Yeah, definitely. And as we kind of come to the end of the show for today, just to wrap things up, just like you said, it's about misinformation and misdirection, just like it has been pretty much any other time we've talked about this administration, regardless of what they're handling. But just a couple things. There is the upcoming 2020 election, so make sure to inform yourself as best you can. And part of informing yourself means looking at what other people that don't think like you think. And it's important to do that and to expose yourself to other ideas. I know just in today, we've only scraped the surface, especially when it comes to the Postal Service, not scandal, but the Postal Service situation. So that's definitely worth looking into because it's been going on for longer than just the media has been covering it now. And it's bigger than just Trump on Twitter. These things are systematic and designed to control and to manipulate. I mean, we covered the past going all the way back to the founding of the country and how these things were designed from the get-go to corral people's votes. And most importantly, make sure you do your own research and make your conclusions and keep your mind open but suspicious. What are your closing thoughts?
Well, I agree with you 100%. I think the one thing that terrifies politicians the most is an educated voter base. So the more educated you get, the better off we are as a country. It's good to have politicians scared of the voters because when they lose that fear of being able to get reelected, because you remember, that's all politicians want. Most politicians start out with all of the zeal and vigor and noble causes but most American citizens tend to feel. And they think that getting into politics is what's going to get them to that. And there have been people like Jesse Ventura, who was the former governor of Minnesota. He thought, well, you know what? If I run for office, I can change it. I can make a difference. And what he realized is that when he got into office, the system is not designed to be changed, certainly not for the disadvantage of the politicians. And he spent 2 terms as governor and hated it. He got blocked at every possible corner, and he was just beaten down and frustrated when he left office. And that's not the typical reaction. The typical reaction is a politician goes in there, they learn how to play the game, and then they slowly get corrupted over time. And then they lose that fear of the voter because at that point, the only thing that they want is to get reelected. And as long as they get reelected, they'll say and do anything. They don't care about you, the voter. They don't care about the district, the constituents, the county, the state, the country. They don't care. All they care about is getting reelected. And when there's a danger of that, because you as a voter are educated and you know what their position is and what their voting history is and what their philosophy is, then there's a chance that you're not going to vote for that. And that's what scares them. So let's scare the politicians. And I'm not just talking Trump. I'm talking every politician out there. Let's scare the hell out of them and educate ourselves and learn what the topics are and what the controversies are and what their positions are, and then make an educated decision when we go to the polls.
Absolutely. And I think that's not easy. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's important. And as Americans and as humans, and I think that's one of the most important things we can do. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to be difficult.